Hello and welcome to the Choirlosophy Podcast. This is episode 145, Teaching Skills, Not Facts, with Melanie Trecek-King. This week I am excited to have Melanie as our guest. Melanie is a science educator who specializes in teaching science to non-music majors. In addition to her expertise in the field of science, Melanie is passionate about helping individuals improve their thought process and metacognition, which means just thinking about the way you're thinking. She is making major waves online with her highly recommended websites thinkingispower.com and the Mental Immunity Project. Today's episode will explore the value of improving one's own thought processes and metacognition. We will dive deep into the concepts of critical thinking and the power of self-reflection. Melanie will share her insights and experiences as an educator and provide practical advice and strategies that can be applied to any discipline or profession. Whether you're a musician, a teacher, a student, or simply someone who wants to improve their cognitive abilities, this episode is for you. Another reminder that we are still taking applications and enrollments for the opportunity to come to Kansas City June 21st to 25th and sing with Contra KC and our Choral Scholars Ensemble. Anybody over 18? Come and sing. We're going to have a great week. It's going to be incredible music. It's an incredible ensemble. So join me. Go to contraikc.com for details. As always, don't forget to use that Choirlosophy checkout code at all the websites that affiliate with this show. That's your sitereadingfactory.com and your graphite publishing, ryanmain.com, mymusicfolders.com, and choirlosophy.com/voce-vista. Discounts at all of those products. So go check them out. Links are in the show notes. Are you tired of managing multiple platforms to sell tickets, fundraise, and market your performances? Look no further than Ludus.com, an all-in-one solution that's easy to use and free to your organization. With Ludus, you'll have access to a suite of tools and resources specifically designed for the performing arts. From ticket sales to merchandise and fundraising, Ludus has got you covered. So why not give it a try? Save time, money, and resources. Choirlosophy listeners can go to ludus.com/choirlosophy for an upgrade for free to their marketing suite. And of course, Patreon is keeping the lights on, and that is so incredibly important. If you appreciate the content that you hear on the Choirlosophy Podcast weekly, as it is a weekly production now, head over to patreon.com/choirlosophy. $3 a month is all you need to get in the door for that suite of extra materials there, a private podcast that drops once a month, and a variety of other benefits for heading over there to Patreon. The producers, the MVPs over at Patreon are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I am here with Melanie Trecek-King. Melanie is a science educator, a scientist, and also, I'm kind of embarrassed to acknowledge the wife of a very well-known choral musician who I have not yet had on the podcast, and so I think that's a pretty funny thing. So, Anthony, when you're listening to this, I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna come after you. But I'm really excited to talk with Melanie today about the ways in which we can solidify, we can make more powerful, we can make more robust our own thinking processes, which I think are important for anyone, not just for scientists. So, Melanie, welcome to the podcast.
I am happy to be here. Thank you. And actually, yes, I met my husband in choir in college like a million years ago.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we were at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and our senior year, we took a choir trip. Actually, just a little funny side tangent. I had, do you remember Wilson Phillips?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I had that short haircut. It did not look good on me. He didn't notice me. He's going to be totally embarrassed that I told this story. He didn't notice me for like a year, and then my hair started to grow out, and we took a choir tour to Lithuania and Sweden. And he noticed me at the airport and weaseled his way into the seat next to me. And we've been together ever since. It was 25 years.
That is really funny. So we share that in common. I met my wife in choir in college also. And our relationship also started on a choir tour. So we went on the choir tour single and came back together and have been together ever since.
That's wonderful. It's a great place to meet others, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's funny. And she will, since you told an embarrassing story, I'll start with one as well. I had no idea that she was into me at all on that choir tour because I was just so obtuse and not picking up on it. The clue that I had was that I had purchased some chocolates at a store along the way on the road, and she was sitting next to me on the bus and started telling people around us that we had some chocolates, right? I noticed that. I was like, what do you mean we have chocolates? Those are my chocolates. I bought those chocolates. But that was my first clue. She was referring to my stuff as our stuff. And it turns out I was right, and we've been married for 17 years. So.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, really funny. All right, well, let's dive in here with a little bit about your background. What is it that you do on a day-to-day basis, and what is your journey in your science education?
I got my graduate degree at Nebraska on prairie succession, so fire ecology in the Great Plains, and had a wonderful time. My husband got a job in Boston, so we moved across the country. And I found a job teaching at a community college, and I adore teaching at a community college. It is an incredibly diverse environment, and I specialize in courses that are for people who don't want to be scientists when they grow up, so the non-major science courses. And again, I love those courses. One of my favorite things to do when I'm with Anthony at various events is to ask people what they remember from their last science class. Mm-hmm. And I generally get like deer in the headlight looks, or sometimes constipated looks, because it was not a pleasant experience and they don't remember anything. And so I was teaching non-majors biology, which is, again, the course that most non-science majors take. And I just remember thinking, this is not what most people need to know when they grow up. Like the stages of protein synthesis and the stages of mitosis, as interesting as those are not necessarily something that students are going to remember, let alone need to use in their life. And if they do need to use it, they can look it up. And so I went to my department and said, can we do something different? And they supported me in the process. We actually stopped. We took intro bio off the books and replaced it with a course called Science for Life, which teaches what I call skills, not facts. So critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy skills. And the whole course is based on teaching students to be able to use those skills to be good consumers of information and make evidence-based decisions. Mm-hmm. And along the process, there wasn't a textbook that I wanted them to use. I mean, there's some books that I could recommend, but I just figured I would start writing content. And so I started publishing it on my on a website, which I call Thinking is Power. And that leads me to where I am, I suppose.
That's wonderful. I've actually long been a proponent of the idea that the process we use to come to our conclusions is oftentimes more important than the conclusion themselves, because of how frequently we come to wrong conclusions. Solidifying the process actually might be a better use of our time. Is that a weird way to think of it, or do you like that?
No, I love it, actually. And fun fact again, because this audience will appreciate that I stole this Teach Skills Not Facts from Anthony.
Oh, okay. So in what context?
We spent a lot of choral musicians tend to work nights and weekends, right? So we spend a lot of time together in the morning. And, he teaches students how to, through music, have difficult conversations. And I teach students how to think. And so we got to talking about how these skill sets overlap. And we actually created a curriculum, a DEI curriculum based on that. We call critical conversations. But he's long said that he teaches students skills, not songs. And so he jokes that he's lazy, where instead of teaching students to learn every single song, he teaches them what they need to do to learn those songs. And I had written an article that I wanted to publish, and it was about the course. And I kept thinking, I need a good title for this. And it was staring me straight in the face, and I didn't see it. I'm like, it's Teach Skills, Not Facts. And I just legit stole that from Anthony, because he does this teach skills, not songs approach. But it does show the power of how skills in different fields of knowledge, and every different field has its own way of knowing, its own way of doing, its skills required to produce knowledge or whatever is the output of that. And so the skills overlap in both of them, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I oftentimes tell students, if they're asking my advice for how to find a voice teacher. That's one of the things that I bring up right away. Just make sure you're looking for a voice teacher and not a songs teacher, because they do both exist. There are people who will take a kid's money and all they're going to teach them is how the song goes, and it's something we sometimes have to really look out for. Or are you finding a teacher who is building your voice using the skills of, that would help you beyond just learning that song? And I think that sounds like what Anthony is doing as well. But yeah, that's an interesting parallel. I really like that a lot. Because I think ultimately that's one of the nuts, so to speak, of the conversation here that we want to get to is, why would it be that people who are not scientists need to learn to think in a kind of scientific way? And when you mention different ways of kind of knowing or approaching different concepts, I don't think it's to suggest that a scientific approach is the approach to everything in life. There are certain types of things that are spiritual, certain types of things that are more along the philosophical, or in other words, I'm going to explore an idea that might have no basis in reality, but there's value also in just exploring ideas, right? So how would you frame that for non-scientists, non-science majors when you teach it? How do you explain why these skills are still important for you, even if they're an artist like me?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that our world is built on science, and not understanding that world comes at your own peril. One of the guiding lights for me when I teach is that I want students to be able to think better so that they can make better decisions. We act on our beliefs, whether they're true or not. And so if you want to make good decisions, you have to align your beliefs with reality as much as we know that to be true. And as for, you're right, a scientific approach isn't necessarily the best approach for everything. There are things outside of science that are absolutely important, but we're born thinking, but a lot of us assume that since we've always been doing it, it must work for us. It must be good enough. We must be good at it. And that is absolutely not true. Is through all of human history, it took until about the 17th century to start a scientific revolution, even in its infancy. Statistics wasn't invented until a couple of centuries later. It is not natural for us to think that way. Yet we know that thinking that way can provide us with a better understanding of our world and empower us to make better decisions. That's, by the way, why I call my site Thinking is Power. We've all heard knowledge is power, and that is true, but there's just so much to know. It is not humanly possible to know all of it. So my approach is thinking better. And one of those things is knowing where knowledge lives, like understanding where the output of that knowledge is most reliable and going to that source. I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but yes, the idea that understanding that your automatic thinking might not lead you to the best conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if we're not thinking about how we're thinking, that kind of that metacognition aspect. And I think about in my world, because I teach in public school, so I'm 9 through 12, and I spend a lot of my energy and quite a bit of episodes on this show talking about education more broadly. And there are some specific, I guess, holes or automatic thinking that I think about, that I notice a lot in how we structure our public education. And one of those is that when we are trying to approach certain research aspects in education, there's a certain, I don't know if you've ever come across this, but there is a certain reputation that education research tends to have in terms of being relatively low quality. So things like very small sample sizes, never even attempting to replicate, let alone actually replicating. Oftentimes you can get entire school districts to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars on a new teaching method that's never been replicated and that's based on sample sizes that would, I would say probably get a kid a failing grade in certain types of science classes. And so that's something I've seen as frustrating. And I think in a lot of ways, those types of things come about because we want the results of the study to be true, And so then we see something that's favorable in a education paper, and we like that conclusion, so we just run with it. Are those do those ever those types of issues ever come up for you, or do you see or talk about like the low quality versus high quality studies with your students?
Yeah, and not necessarily about education. I think at the college level, we're a bit more buffered from the kinds of constant like administrative approaches to change how we
Right.
teach.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
which is why, honestly, I had the freedom to create a class that I did. And so, there really is something to be said about this kind of academic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when I teach my students, I spend a lot of time online. Let me just say that. So I have a Facebook page and a Twitter, and I spend a lot of time trying to communicate these concepts to the public. And what I see a lot is when we all inherently understand at this point that science is reliable, and we all want then what we believe to be based in science, because that gives us some level of justification, some level of, well, it must be true because it's based in science. And so then what they'll do is go to like Google Scholar and they'll type in their terms, and it will lead them to, the first study or two that might not be in a good journal, or it might not be, a very decent study, like if you go through its methods. But let me back up for a second. So I'm a plant ecologist, and I now publish in critical thinking and misinformation, but there's vast fields of science that I am not qualified to evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of, I teach my students, instead of going to what looks like a scientific study and using that to justify our position, because that's usually what we're doing, to step back and consider how knowledge is produced in that area. If we're talking about something that can be done through studies, there's going to be all kinds of individual studies, but then people will go through and do meta-analyses and systematic reviews where they compile studies related to that particular question. And then at one level up, they'll compile meta-analyses and systematic reviews and make guidelines and have consensus statements. So if you don't know an area very well, your best bet isn't diving into the weeds of a particular study. Recognize your limits and be humble about what it is that you know. Also recognize your tendency to not be honest with yourself, and how what we want to believe will fuel our search for the kind of information that supports what we believe. And instead of trying to support your position, put in neutral search terms into Google Scholar and see if a consensus report or some kind of meta-analysis comes up. Or better yet, try to prove yourself wrong. So don't put it, here's why this is true. Say, what kinds of evidence do we have that this isn't true? Really challenge yourself that way. But the most important thing there was this metacognition, is to understand the kinds of emotional drivers that you might have behind maybe a desire to want to accept that conclusion.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I'm sure you've noticed the phenomenon, because I've seen this on your Thinking is Power site that you've made some posts about this. But the process you just described is oftentimes a process that in the first person narration going on in somebody's head, oftentimes these are things that they think, or that many people think, I do this already, but the other person doesn't. And in reality, it's oftentimes it's all of us doing it. And I'm not even convinced necessarily that even knowing how to do them can completely inoculate us from this problem. I'm kind of the belief that humans can't become fully objective, but it's worth trying, and it's worth getting there, or worth working towards that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And one step forward, because you're right. Each one of us has subjective experiences, and we, in the process of perception, and we form a narrative based on the information that's coming at us. We filter it based on our expectations, our biases, our emotions, and then we make it consistent with what we already believe. So our belief system, and there's a Willem van Quine, I think was his name, had this great concept he called the web of belief. And I literally like to think of, in your brain, there's like a web, and the web is all of your beliefs. At the middle are the core beliefs, the ones that you really feel strongly about, that form the basis of everything else. It's your worldviews, your values, and so on. And then moving out from there, there's a system of beliefs that they all meet at various nodes. They're all connected in some way. Inconsistent beliefs are a problem. So our brain tries to resolve that with making it fit. So now we have this web and new information comes in and it has to fit in that web. If it doesn't fit in that web, then we assume it's not true. We find some way to discount it. We do whatever mental gymnastics we need to do to not have to accept something that we don't want to accept. I like to, you said something earlier that I want to go back to.
If your school or church are in the market for staging products like risers, shelves, podiums, movable platforms, all of the things that you need to set your choir up for success, I would like to strongly urge you to check out StageRight. StageRight's products are sturdy, they're durable, they're easy to use. I have personal experience with the acoustical shelves and some of the platforms that they have at StageRight, and I can tell you, compared to some of the more expensive competitors, they are a really great option to fit inside of a tight school budget, but also to give you the durability and usability that you need. So check out StageRight at stageright.com.
The process is more important than what it is that we actually believe. One of the things that I use in my class is, you've seen the dress, right?
The what?
The dress. The dress.
Yeah. That looks different colors to different people.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's such a great example of what our brain is doing is assuming the lighting that the photo was taken in based on our own assumptions. Okay. But if you show the picture of the dress, and we've all seen the dress, but if you show it in a room full of people, and they're going to see it in different ways. It's, for many people, the first time that they've actually been in a space where they see someone who sees it differently. There's a disagreement there. And the goal there shouldn't be convincing you that the dress is black and blue or gold and white or whatever you see it as. It's, we disagree about this. That's interesting. Why do we disagree?
Yeah.
Let's dig into the process that led us to that belief. The disagreement is much more interesting. The disagreement is much more interesting than the final thing. And it will lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right. And actually that's interesting because that very concept has been presented on this show many, many times. Because ultimately, it's interesting that we disagree. Okay. Meaning that I like to advocate that becomes our first response oftentimes. There's room for other responses too. In other words, there's room for somebody to, like, if somebody makes a position that you really find even abhorrent, that you can have that conversation and you can talk about the morality or the philosophy or the history or the factual nature of that. But I always think that the first reaction ought to be, okay, now why do we disagree though? Let's get to that nugget first. What is it that you experienced? What is it that I experienced that caused us to see it differently? Because if the two of us can see that first, then we're more likely to be able to figure out the other aspects, which I always kind of think of as secondary. Is that nuts?
Yeah, no, it's not. And actually, if we go a step further, so I do an epistemology exercise with my students where I have them question their beliefs. And the first thing I say is, on a scale of 0 to 100, how sure are you that something is true? And then and avoid the extremes, right? The point is to put an actual number on it and then be willing to change that with new evidence. And then, like, how would you test this belief? How would you feel if you were wrong? So there's a series of questions. And I start with, what is the capital of Australia? Okay. Now, most people, Sydney? Okay, so it's not Sydney. Okay, great. I don't know, Melbourne, right? Why would you think it's Sydney, right? And we can explore why you think that's true, even though that it's not. But how would you feel if you were wrong, right? If you think the capital of Australia is Sydney, and I tell you you're wrong, most people are going to go, I don't care, right?
Right.
Like,
for something like that.
Canberra, that's fine. I will accept that then, because I don't care. Imagine though feeling that sure that level of concern about whether your belief is wrong in every other area.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So one of the important things with critical thinking is detaching your beliefs from your identity. So I literally think about, here's a belief, removing it. And it's really difficult sometimes, especially when it's really important to us, or when it attaches us to a social group, or it's something that provides us comfort, whatever it is. There might be a reason that we think it's more important, but it's really hard to be objective about a belief when you care that much.
Now, I'm just going to jump in for just 1 second because I think this is an important point. I would argue that it's harder right now, too, because we are being taught to do the opposite culturally. In other words, we're being taught to attach our beliefs to our identities. And you pick up on it linguistically a lot when people will say things like, as a person with ... I believe this, or as a person who is ... I think this. That is actually an attachment of identity to your belief. It's almost as if it creates a pattern of thinking that a person that fills this description would also think this. And then we start to get into like, is that group of people a monolith? Do they all think the same thing? Because you kind of just claimed that. And people don't realize that they're doing it. And I think that is being culturally rewarded right now, which makes it even more tempting to think the way you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that this obviously isn't a perfect world, right? Because this is really hard to do, but be okay with being wrong, and also let others be wrong, right? When someone is wrong, admits they're wrong, has some sort of growth and changes their mind, that's not a time to mock or to belittle. That's a time, like, changing your mind with evidence is a virtue. We should all be able to do that. But again, it's really hard to do when it's attached to our identity. I want to tie this back with something you said earlier, which is that none of us can be objective, and we can't. It's true. We can try our best to be objective. But we still have our emotions. We still have our own biases. This is why the power of community is so important. A community that's all trying to be objective is much more likely to reach the truth than any individual. So, for example, back to you see this differently than I do. Oh, that's interesting. Why is that? Leaning into that diversity of perspectives is more likely to lead to a conclusion that's more representative of reality. So in science, each scientist is trained to be as objective as possible, but then they have to submit their conclusions and their methodology to other scientists. And each one of them is not only trained to be objective, they're also trained to argue with each other and to find fault in each other's ideas. It's not personal, it's leading to something better. Well, you see it like this, I see it like this. That's interesting. Let's dissect that and lean into that. And over time, the community, because it's providing those checks and balances, is more likely to reach something that resembles objective reality.
Yeah. And I think that you're right. In a perfect world, that would be the case. And, it's interesting because the reason, the kind of the catalyst for me reaching out to you to do this episode actually was that I was challenged to reach out to you. Based on a conversation that was happening on Facebook. You were tagged in the post. You might probably, if you knew what was best for you, you probably would have not read through the entire thread because it was pretty darn toxic. Okay. And it was basically coming from the perspective of a person who had seen something that I had posted and an opinion that I had put into that thread that this person really just did not like. And my approach actually has been, at least from my perspective, to try to do a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. One of my weird superpowers, I guess, is that I don't get upset. Like I don't get riled up, so to speak. In fact, my wife makes fun of me for it all the time because she feels like I have a mood. I just have like one mood all the time. I also wake up in the morning like a robot, and I fall asleep at night like a robot. So it's like,
Okay, now I'm very like I'm so jealous that I kind of don't like you right now.
yeah, that's what she says
I wish I
sometimes.
could sleep like that.
I know, right? And so, what's interesting to me is that when, because partly because of what I do here on the show, I put a lot of really difficult conversations online, and I try to make them be as real as possible with the guest, with myself. It's like if I think a thing, I want to be able to fully talk it out. And for a lot of people, that ultimately ends up being, well, somebody's going to come across an opinion that they don't agree with on this show. Somebody is, because the opinions of everyone are so diverse that it's just impossible, right? So that's kind of the background. And then this person, a colleague, that was a choir person, said, you know who you should talk to? You should talk to Melanie Trecek-King, because she talks a lot about how to think better. And the assumption was, or the implication was, this person was telling me that I could learn a lot from talking to you, and that would make me a better thinker. And this kind of ties back into what we were talking about before, is that, I'm aware that everybody needs to be working on these things. And so I'm sitting here thinking that this other person is out to lunch, but of course the other person's thinking I'm out to lunch. And in reality, we're probably all out to lunch. And the whole purpose of this conversation oftentimes is how do we check ourselves? How do we check those biases? What are the biases? And it's an interesting thing, because my background as an artist and as a musician, I spent a good portion of my undergrad and at the end of my high school years I was fortunate to get some formal logic and philosophy training. But I didn't have any scientific background at all. So in fact, I hated science as a kid. It was one of my least favorite classes, science and math. I did not want to do it. I wouldn't turn in the homework. It was not something that I really enjoyed, but I really enjoyed logic, philosophy, history, economics, those types of pursuits until COVID. And on this show, I had the opportunity back in 2020 to interview some of the top COVID experts in the world, starting with Amish Adalja from Johns Hopkins, came on my show, and I had to start reading papers. I had to start reading articles in scientific journals. I had to start, because I knew as the host of the show, I just didn't want to sound stupid when I was like asking questions. And so what I've discovered, and this is a little bit of a rant, and I want to throw it back to you here. What I've discovered is that the things that I learned about logic as a kid, and the things that I learned about that process, just that way of thinking, have tons of parallels to what we're talking today, and also just to the scientific method in general. And I've also discovered that in the arts, we don't really embrace that in the same way that people in other professions do. And I think part of it is maybe a belief in what it means for us to be artists, as being expressive, creative, feeling rather than cold, calculating. And I've just seen some noticed things over the last 2 or 3 years that I didn't notice before about that distinction between the artist and the scientist. And I wonder, being married to an artist, are these things that you ever think about or come across?
Yeah, so there was a lot in there. And
Yeah, there
I have
was.
some comments for you too. So I would say first, there's actually a lot of scientists I know are also musical.
Yeah.
And Anthony was actually an engineering major in college.
Mm.
And I was a pianist who went to choir. And I know a lot of researchers and medical doctors who play in symphonies and community symphonies and choirs and so on. Science, if you're good at it, is very creative. It has to be, because you're trying to be at the forefront and test things in a way that maybe hasn't been done before. I also something that I got in there. The students that I was teaching before the pandemic, I kind of feel like I failed them in that I was teaching them. So actually, just tangent here. My epiphany came when I was teaching my students the stages of mitosis, and I was using issues-based approaches. And so in this case, it was cancer. I was teaching students the stages of mitosis so that they would understand cancer, which is unregulated cell growth for various ways. So, I thought I was teaching students something that would be applicable to them. And yet now looking back over the pandemic, we had a new virus, and we had a new vaccine, and we had new treatments for it. And the process of science was playing out in real time. And science takes time, right? There's a lot of false starts, and there's bad studies, and there's studies that found the wrong thing through either methodology, or it was just a coincidence, and it takes time. I noticed a lot of people, again, this is coming from my experience online, they think of science like a collection of facts, like science proves something, right? And when science proves something, then of course I'll accept it, but science hasn't proven it. And science never proves, right? It never gets to absolute proof. And that's one of its strengths, is it recognizes, it's humble enough to recognize that we should be able to change our minds. That doesn't mean, however, that we don't have enough evidence to tentatively accept a conclusion. And not all conclusions are equally tentative. Some are much more supported than others. But all of this was playing out. And then as soon as politics got involved and it became an identity issue, then people started we believe a lot of what we believe based on trust. We don't like to think that of ourselves. We think that we follow evidence to a conclusion, but usually we take shortcuts because there's just not enough time or brain power to evaluate evidence for everything. And so what we do is people we trust believe this. And if the people that we trust are people in a tribe or people in our social group or however we identify, as opposed to placing our trust tentatively in a process, in a community that is using a process that has been shown to find reliable knowledge over time, then that's where people can lead themselves astray, sometimes with really unfortunate consequences. Mm-hmm. I have questions for you now. Can I?
Please.
Okay. So I remember being tagged. My memory, I have a memory of a gnat. My short-term memory is absolutely terrible. I remember being tagged. I remember seeing part of it. And then you contacted me, I think, shortly after that.
Yep.
Is that the first time that you found thinking is power? And I'm curious, if you found thinking is power, then was there anything there that was actually useful to you?
Oh my goodness, yes. So yes, that was the first time I had seen thinking as power. Actually, maybe it was a weird coincidence on that day, because I think 2 days prior, I had seen a post that either you put on, and I saw it because I'm friends with Anthony on Facebook, or maybe Anthony posted. It was something about a life change that you guys just had, maybe a job change or something.
Yes, we posted that we're leaving our full-time work.
Right. And I think, and so I had seen that. And that had kind of put an idea in my head, because I had seen a little bit about what it was that you do, and also having noticed that there were quite a bit of posts on your Thinking is Power that are actually things that I have also posted and shared. I'm going to give you an example. I copied out some of them here. I did a blog a couple years ago, a blog and an episode that accompanied it with a professor of rhetoric. So logic and rhetoric, that's what he teaches at... Is
that Eric Smith, maybe?
Eric Smith, yep.
Yep, I'm familiar with his work, yes.
Yep. And so I had written a blog that talked about things like anchoring bias, like the availability heuristic, all of those types of things, and you've posted about some of those things. So I just my first things that I noticed was just that in a lot of ways we're speaking the same language, and possibly as I was hinting at before, you're coming at it from that science aspect, and I'm coming at it from my logic training and my logic and rhetoric training and linguistic study and all of that kind of thing. I think about it more in terms of how do I become a better communicator. How do I use language to make what I'm trying to say come across more clearly to other people? Because ultimately, to me, it's not about me trying to convince you that I'm right. It's about me trying to convince you to hear me. I want you to hear what I'm actually saying. I don't want you to hear what I'm saying and then come back with that straw man argument. I want to make that as difficult as possible for you. I want it to be totally clear and obvious what it is that I'm actually saying, and that happens. I notice that happens to me a lot because I'm a podcaster, and the way you promote a podcast is you clip things out of the podcast and you put them on the internet, which means you get them out of context. And then once you get them out of context, then it can take on whatever meaning anybody wants it to mean. And then I find myself having to defend an argument that I didn't make. And so that's kind of my life. It's worth it. I love doing this, but that is essentially what my life around doing a podcast is and that anchoring bias thing is actually a great example. So let's say I post something. In fact, I'll give a good example because it's been a couple of years ago, and so my audience might not remember this. There was a guest that I had a couple of years back who has been working on creating a more inclusive music conservatory. And by creating that kind of old world Juilliard style high level music training, but in a way that more students of different economic backgrounds could actually access it. And that's been his project. And there was a part of that episode where he was talking about how an administrator at a school he'd worked at had told him something that he found very troubling, and that was that the administrator said, "We need to get more black kids in band, so let's do more jazz." And he told that story, and the way that me and my promotions people chose to promote that episode is that we talked about how a student's skin color doesn't correlate reliably to what type of music would light up their eyes. And I stand by that still to this day. I think that that's actually from my education experience, I think that's an accurate statement. I've seen black kids who just absolutely love K-pop, Korean pop, dance stuff, right? I can't guess ahead of time that they're going to like that based on what they look like. But how it was chosen to be interacted with in the Facebook version of that was that I was promoting the concepts of colorblind racism, that I shouldn't care about what skin color they are, it's blah blah blah. And the reason that people saw it that way is because somebody grabbed that quote, attached a new context to it, and then everybody who comes onto that post on Facebook sees it with that context instead of the one that I put up there. And now I've got to fight against that anchoring bias that people have and trying to argue for this thing that I hadn't even claimed in the first place. It's this whole big mess. Thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose you probably saw it the last couple of days I posted straw man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I posted straw man because I have seen so many positions being straw manned on social, and I was really frustrated. So I thought I'd put something out. So for those of you who maybe didn't see it, what I do fallacy graphics, and what I do is I explain the fallacy and then I give an example. And this example was someone claims that we should eat less beef. Raising cattle requires a lot of land, a lot of water, and it releases a lot of greenhouse gases, right? So we should eat less beef. And the other person says, so you want to force everyone to be a vegetarian, right? So it's a clear straw man. Now, we could argue the first argument on the merits, but what happened was people who were triggered by that first initial argument responded to the argument itself, and ironically was straw manning the argument in their attempt to, I don't know what they were trying to do.
I think it's a response. I think it's a response from fear.
Fear? What do you mean?
Well, okay. So let's say to keep your beef argument going. So you say we should eat more beef because X, Y, Z, and let's say there is a person who he hears that, or he or she hears that argument, and their first thought could be the worst possible outcome of that policy, which means that now, okay, less beef, but then less beef, and then less beef, and then eventually down the road, we're in a situation where we've got to all eat bugs in some kind of a post-apocalyptic world or whatever.
People brought up the bugs thing too, to be fair. In real
yes,
life, they brought up the bug.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's there is a certain way of thinking that would cause us to hear one scenario and immediately go to the worst possible outcome. And then that becomes the thing we respond to. And so when I say fear, I mean maybe it's the slippery slope kind of a concept. That which sometimes, to be fair, slopes have been slippery throughout history, but it doesn't mean that every slope will be slippery.
Well, it's a fallacy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. That's really good, and I think that these things are interesting to discuss. But I see them coming up all the time, and I see them in music education. I see them in obviously science. During the pandemic, one of the things we were talking about, the political tribalism. You said something about that earlier. Now, my particular perspective, people who listen to the show already know this because I'm very open about it. But I get accused a lot of being a centrist, but I actually am not a centrist, because to me a centrist implies that you're somewhere in the middle of two things. But my perspective is that I'm like vehemently opposed to all the things. so I'm more.
Are you contrarian? Do you identify as a contrarian?
Well, I'm very skeptical of political solutions to problems because of how vastly complicated the world is, and I'm a big believer in the knowledge problem. Is that like once you like the skeptical of the idea that a small group of humans could gather enough knowledge to solve problems for millions and millions, in some cases billions of people. And that oftentimes those attempts to solve problems end up creating new problems that we didn't actually foresee, and then the cycle resumes and sometimes exacerbates itself. So what I'm always advocating for is humility in whether or not the solution we propose would actually work. And just like, it's not to say that we're totally frozen and can't act and we can't do anything to try to make the world better, but always having that humility in the back of your mind that say, this thing that I think will work actually might make it worse, and I need to be on the lookout for that, and I need to be humble enough when I see that it's not working to change course, etc. And so when the pandemic started, because I'm very much opposed to the two-party system in the United States, I don't have a dog in the fight, and I started to notice that we were getting into this situation where you've got a group of people who are on one extreme talking about how COVID is fake and or not a big deal and we should just ignore it and go on with our life. But then we also had a group of people who were on the other side of that, basically making arguments, extremely fallacious arguments like, well, if it saves one life. Problem with that argument was, and always was, that assumes that there is a zero risk scenario that is possible. And if your policy is going to be based on a zero risk scenario, then you're not going to have any type of basis for it. And so there was this, the way I saw it was two large politically powerful groups that were both getting it wrong. And as I started to interview more and more COVID experts, there were probably 5 or 6 that came on my show that in 2020 and 2021. I started to feel very strongly that was the case, and it put me in an interesting position in a very left-wing dominated profession like music education is that it started to cause people to assume that I was making a political case myself, when in reality I just wanted to figure out the best way for us to keep doing choir, the safest possible scenario, rather than waiting for it to be zero risk for us to start again, that kind of thing. And so I think that is an interest that you're exactly right. The political affiliation does create one of those biases that is hard for us to see past.
Yeah, it literally colors our view, our perception of reality. I'll come back to that for a second. And if I forget, I always tell my students this because I'm going to forget my train of thought, but I think it's important currently. So if you could remind me to come back.
Okay.
There's something, a lot of denial is actually motivated by something we call solution aversion, which is not liking the solution to something. So for example, for the current fossil fuel denial strategy for climate change was, I don't want to say started, but really perfected by the tobacco industry denial. And all of that was essentially like a lot of people think that maybe that denial is motivated by money. And certainly there's a lot of money to be made in industry by not being regulated. But it actually came from not liking government regulations. So an ideological stance against, well, if this problem is real, it must mean then that we have to have a solution that involves government regulations. So let's deny the problem to begin with. I personally thought on the straw man post with the beef that a lot of that was coming from not either the idea of somebody being told what to eat, and or maybe a skin in the game when it comes to cattle production. And so, like, there's that famous Upton Sinclair quote, something like, "It's difficult to get a man to accept something when his paycheck demands that he doesn't." I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But vested interests are certainly a motivation for solution denial, solution aversion. So I thought a lot of it was coming from that. But here's the problem. What I learned from that, by the way, was that maybe I really should continue to use less triggering examples, because the moment I use examples that could potentially be triggering, people don't see the fallacy, they see the issue, which is kind of ironic. But when it comes to strawmanning somebody's argument, if somebody is making an argument that you don't agree with, then one of the things that we're prone to do, either for emotional reasons or ideological reasons, is that we exaggerate it to the most extreme form that we can imagine, maybe we've seen, whatever it is. The problem with that is you're arguing something that the original person didn't argue. And again, if our goal with argumentation is to come to a better understanding of reality, then a better approach would be to steelman the argument. Okay, so what I hear you saying is this, and try to make the argument as much as you can, so that if somebody from the outside didn't know what your position was, it would look like you actually held that position. So really understanding, having enough kindness, enough empathy to be able to accept that argument for what it is and assume it's coming from a good place. And then arguing on its merits, as opposed to it looks like an easy win to just, twist it, torture it to a form that it didn't exist in. So the straw man, it really is one of the best ways to argue in a way where you don't have to actually argue the position. I asked you to help me remember something. What was it?
Well, I don't think you have told me what it was. You just said you were on a train of thought about two things.
Oh, crap. See, that's my problem. See,
now later
that's
on,
why my students don't remind me of stuff.
That's okay. Later on, I'll be able to rewind the tape and see if that's true. Maybe it's my fault, but
I'll remember it in the middle of the night. I'll be like, "That's what I meant to say." Goodness.
Well, while you're thinking, I'll just ask you. So you're talking about the steel man, which I think that's a very powerful mental exercise that I try to put myself through a lot, especially when people come at me with something they disagree with. Like, I'm trying to figure out. I would like to be articulate enough in my position to be able to be persuasive, as I was saying before, which means that oftentimes the steel man of the other position, before you have to have the argument, is really important, because then you're inoculated, almost vaccinated against the other ideas that you might encounter, and then sometimes as a result of steel manning an argument, you change your own opinion, and I think that's when you know it's working.
Yeah. The vaccinating against is interesting because maybe it is a self-protective mechanism against not wanting to change the mind for whatever emotional or biased reason. I think in my preparation for today, I listened to a couple of episodes, and I'm pretty sure I heard Jonathan Haidt's Elephant and the Rider.
Yes, yeah, that would have been in my episode with Rena Esmail. We did an episode about the righteous mind.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
find that's a really important concept for students, and I start with it with metacognition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for the listeners who aren't familiar, so the elephant and the rider analogy it dovetails with Daniel Kahneman's systems 1 and 2, which is the idea that we have different types of thinking. It's broadly generalized and definitely oversimplified. I obviously Kahneman won a Nobel Prize, so he deserves all the credit for his work with biases and heuristics. But I find Jonathan Haidt's version of it more useful for students because it's an easier to visualize an elephant and the rider. So the idea is that in your brain you've got an elephant and a rider, and the elephant is always on. It's difficult to control. It's emotional. It's tribal. It's biased. It takes shortcuts. It's your autopilot thinking that we just don't have the mental energy to evaluate absolutely everything. So the elephant's just always on, and it's using what it already knows to get there.
Yep.
The rider is the part of our brain that we think is us, the part of our brain that's capable of logical thought. But the elephant is really hard to control. So most of the time, what we do is just use our rider to justify whatever the elephant has come to. So the elephant suggests something, and the rider goes, here are all my reasons for why my elephant is right. All the while thinking, of course, that it wasn't an emotional decision, that it was actually critical thinking and evidence-based. And then when we get to talking with somebody else, I mean, they have elephants and riders too. So we think we're talking to their rider, but we're actually talking to their elephant.
Mm-hmm.
And so to have these kinds of productive conversations, drill down to at its core, talk to their elephant. There is something on an emotional and bias level that you both probably agree on. There are values that are similar, so that you can have a more honest conversation, not just with the other person, but you can be more honest with yourself in terms of your own thinking and why you might want to come to believe things. And one of the things, I'm leaving this analogy just for a second, but when it comes to these value-based decisions and these motivations, and most of us are trying to make the world a better place, especially
Right.
for educators. We're trying to help students. And so if we really want to help students, if we really want to help people, we have to understand problems. And to understand problems, we have to understand our own thinking, right? The metacognitive approach of understanding our biases and emotions and so on. We have to then understand the value of evidence and try to make our decisions, our understanding of a problem as evidence-based as possible. Our intentions may be good, but if we're not following evidence in the most objective way that we can, then we might end up doing more harm than good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're exactly right. And especially when you said that we're all trying to make the world a better place, I think that's actually a really good heuristic for how we interact with other people, is to even possibly make the assumption, until we're proven otherwise, that the person we're dealing with and the ideas that we're dealing with are created by people who genuinely think they are good ideas that will leave the world better. My shout out for my friend Angel Eduardo, who's an author and has been on the show a couple times, who came up with an idea that he called star manning, which is the way he explains it. So he explains it as is steel manning, but also to include the person and not just the idea. So to the steel man an argument, as he would explain it, is like we talked about earlier, you're putting your ideas up against the best possible arguments for the other side. And his point is that that's not even enough. What we need to do is put our ideas up against the best possible arguments of the other side, while also picturing in our mind the best possible version of that other person. To assume that their intention,
not just argument.
yes, the best possible.
Okay. Yep.
Because what we oftentimes do is we create a monster in our mind that we are arguing against. This person is a bigot. This person's a racist, a homophobe. This is a problematic, person, and we attach the ideas to the person, and then we forget oftentimes that, like Carl Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people, and they are this person that we're arguing with has been captured by whatever influences that they've been captured by in their life. There but for the grace of God go I could have had those same ideas if I had been in that same exact environment. I could have, right? So the star manning idea is to trying to put yourself in, not only in the other person's argument, but in their shoes while you're doing it. And I think it's a way forward with empathy, but also better critical thinking.
Yeah, actually, one of the key points of arguing better is the principle of charity. It is assuming good intentions from the other arguer. You want them to do that for us, right? So we should also do that for other people. There's also, circling back to the dress, there's a concept called naive realism. Are you familiar with this?
No.
So naive realism is the idea that we all assume that our perceptions of reality are accurate, that they are what they are, that we see reality as it is. And the problem with that, of course, is that we don't. So if we circle back to the dress, so just imagine I'm in a room where I see the dress is black and blue. Actually, Anthony and I have had lots of conversations about this because he sees it as gold and white. I'm like, how in the world can you see it as gold and white? It is clearly black and blue. And by the way, the actual dress is black and blue. So I just want to put it out there that I was right.
I was black and blue also. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm like, how can you see it as white and gold? But here's the thing. Imagine that's a dress. Okay, I'm going to come back to naive realism here for a second. But our perception of reality, the team that we play on can actually influence our view of reality. So like, have you ever watched a sporting event with someone who's rooting for the other team?
Oh, yeah.
All against a team, like I see it as that is so unfair, and the other team is seeing it as obviously the other way. Studies have shown that how we view a protest, if we agree with what they're protesting, we think it's peaceful. But if you don't agree with them, you think it is violent. Or even like how we view the economy. So if you notice graphs over time of people's perception of the economy, if you lean left versus lean right, so a Republican is not wins office, and if you lean left, it's like, oh, the economy is in the shitter, right? Versus if you are a Republican and a Democrat is elected, well, now obviously the economy was great and now it sucks. So literally who we are rooting for, the team we're playing on, is changing how we perceive reality. So let's go back to the dress here. Imagine that this isn't just something as banal as the color of a dress. We're actually seeing some sort of reality that we're convinced is real because we see reality as it is. There's naive realism. Now, if you disagree with me, I'm going to first assume, well, you just don't have the facts. So I'm going to give you my facts. I'm going to tell you why you should see it my way. But you still don't, of course, because you still don't see that dress white and gold, right? Okay, well, now I'm going to assume you're stupid. Okay, well, I mean, I can try a little bit more. Or worse, I'm going to think you're evil. Okay, again, this is a dress, but imagine this is something more consequential than the color of a dress. So we do this all the time where we're assuming things about the other person, and they might just be perceiving reality differently than you for various reasons.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting part. Why is it different, right? Assume good intentions, lean into why it is that we disagree. Now let's try to work it out together. If our goal actually is to help people, or it is to understand reality as it is, that's our best bet.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. And especially in a world where we as humans can only, this is just a simple example, but I like it as an illustrator. We can see something like in the neighborhood of like 1.5% of all the light that's in the spectrum. We can hear something in the same neighborhood, 2 or 3% of all the sound that is happening around us. Yet we can be so sure that we're right. And when you think about our limited ability to even perceive the world around us as it actually is, I don't think that should instill a lot of confidence, in the sense that we should maybe approach these things with a little bit more humility when we're arguing about something with another person who has a strongly held position also. There's got to be at least some part of our brain that says, you know what, I could be the one that's missing things here.
Yeah, and actually, you just said something there. Circle back to Daniel Kahneman,
Mm-hmm.
who Nobel Prize winning economist.
I love his stuff.
He was asked if you had a magic wand and you could rid the world of one bias, what would it be? And he said overconfidence.
Yeah.
Because if you're overconfident, you assume you're right. You're not going to listen to why you might be wrong, and you won't change your mind. So this idea of humility, of being, when you say skeptical, so you said something earlier, it reminded me of, I always tell my students, it is really hard to recognize these biases in yourself, right? It's hard to recognize all the illogical arguments that you make to yourself, to recognize the areas in which your perception is misleading you, right? We have blind spots. That's why we need other people. It's hard to recognize all that. If we want to do that, we have to recognize our own fallibility. We have to realize that we might be wrong and to be open to others' perceptions that might actually change our mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We have to have already decided that changing our mind is actually something to be proud of, rather than an admission of defeat. Because if that is our posture towards the argument or towards the other person that we're having a conversation with, or even taking it back to science, specifically towards the other scientist maybe who has a competing theory, or towards maybe the team of scientists who did a study that had a different finding than your study had, or maybe their study had a null finding and yours had a positive finding, and right, and so there's this whole that, like, did my team lose because we we had a different finding, right? If we could shed that, then we would be a lot more interested in getting to the next step.
Yeah, have you read Adam Grant?
I've seen several posts and things of Adam Grant, but I haven't really dug into anything yet.
The little bit that I know about you, you would totally dig Adam Grant. His book "Think Again" is his most recent, and it's just brilliant. And actually, I think in the book he quotes Kahneman, who says something like, "So he was someplace, and Kahneman, like, somebody changed his mind on something, or he was shown to be wrong, and he seemed almost joyful about it. And so he was asked, and he said, 'Yeah, I'm happy to be wrong. It means I'm less wrong now.'" Right.
Yeah.
So Grant says, if you can embrace the joy of being wrong. So back to Sydney. Okay. It's not capital of Australia isn't Sydney. It's Canberra. I now know what the capital of Australia is. That's pretty great.
Yeah.
Do I care I was wrong before? I was working with what I knew. There's no judgment. There's no shame. I was just wrong. But now I'm less wrong. That's
Right.
pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I think I'll maybe put an illustration on that with a music student story, and then I think I could probably talk to you all afternoon. But I'll let you wrap it up, because I've got to take my son to baseball in not too long. So all right, so I was teaching a voice lesson. There's a senior girl. I'd been teaching this kid for 3.5, maybe 4 years by this point. She was getting ready to head off to music education school the next year, so she was, her voice was still a big part of her study. She wanted to be a better singer. And I use Voce Vista, which is a spectrograph software in my classroom. And it's actually one of the sponsors here of the show. You can show the singer their overtone series that they're using, and they can see it in real time. And one of the ways that I love that tool is that the student can see visually, not just hear or feel, whether or not they are fully resonating. Okay? And this is a kid who was struggling with a lot of tension when she would go up into her upper register. And so over and over and over, I'm having her go sing the same pattern and look at it on the screen. And eventually, after about 3 or 4 tries, she got it. Like, she sounded like a 35-year-old woman. It would, like, resonant, beautiful, full overtone series are lighting up on the screen, and you can see all of it. And of course, she finally gets it, and I respond like a teacher would when their student has victory. I'm like, yes, you got it. That was exactly it. That was exactly it. And after I'm done dancing around, I turn around to look at her, and she's crying. Okay. And I said, what is going on? Like, why are you not excited? I'm excited. And her response was, yeah, but I should have just gotten it right the first time.
Oh, Poor
And
thing.
she's like, I knew how to do it, but I just couldn't do it. And it took me and I said, no, 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 you're missing, this is not how you think about this. It is normal to struggle through the process. What the victory is that you made a breakthrough. It's not a defeat that you came into the lesson. In her mind, I'm a senior, I've got a music scholarship. I should just like already be able to do this. And I was able to teach her in that moment about this very thing I think that we were just talking about, is that it's the joy of getting more right, not the pain of having been wrong in the past, that we have to lock into.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. And I hope I hope the lesson landed with her, because that's really a growing moment to be able to recognize, like, gosh, what is the Muhammad Ali quote? Something like, if you had the same positions that you did 10 years ago, then you're not growing. I totally paraphrase that, but the whole point is we can't be the same person that we were. The whole point is to change our mind and to allow others to change our minds as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been so much fun, Melanie. I really, really appreciate your time. And this is just, I think I'm sensing a lot of kindred spirit here. It seems like you and I are interested in a lot of the same things, but like for different reasons, which is awesome.
Yes, I agree. And my husband and I lapse over these things too. Like there's so many overlap between these different fields, and they, each one can better us in the other areas, right? Anybody who's completely logical and completely rational, I mean, there's still the part of your brain that needs those other things. The point is to be aware of it and to use it wisely. And if you read Adam Grant, Think Again, I'd love to know what you think of it. So make sure you let me know.
Yes, absolutely. And on the way out, why don't you tell us more about your website, how people can find that, the best ways to connect on social media with what you're doing. That would be awesome.
Great. So thank you for that. My website is thinkingispower.com. That's where I try to put everything. I am on social, on Facebook and Twitter at Thinking Powers. I'm also the education director for the Mental Immunity Project, which, so mentalimmunityproject.org. And it is trying to help people understand their mind as having an immune system where they can vaccinate themselves against harmful bugs, where they can practice things that keep their mental immune system in good health so that they don't get infected with bad ideas. So yes, mentalimmunityproject.org too.
That's awesome. And I will put links to those things in the show notes, along with other resources that we mentioned throughout this episode. And I think it's going to be helpful for some people. And I love, so every once in a while on the show, we get to do these non-choir specific episodes, which I find fascinating. And I appreciate your help. And hopefully it's helpful to others.
I really appreciate the opportunity to flex my choral nerd muscle. So
Yeah.
I call myself a choral groupie. I'm a professional choral groupie. So thank you for that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. That's nerd heaven for me. I love talking about that stuff. And actually, if you've been listening for quite a while, you've probably heard some of those very same themes pop up. And so that was a really good expert conversation with somebody who teaches this kind of thing for a living. So what a great idea. And thanks everybody for listening. And of course, on the way out, like, share, leave comments, join the Choralosophers Facebook page, go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Choralosophy, and join up over there as well.